there, and welcome to the latest Climate Perspectives podcast interview with me, Andy Walker. Today, I've got a fascinating subject to look at, and that is decarbonisation of transport. And the Research Hub for Decarbonised, Adaptable and Resilient Transport Infrastructures aims to deliver co-created research that plots viable pathways and solutions for delivering a resilient net zero transport system that works for people and communities. I'm joined today by Phil Blythe, who heads up that particular hub. Phil is also Professor of Intelligent Transport Systems at Newcastle University and a former Chief Scientific Advisor at the Department for Transport. So I think we can safely say that Phil knows his stuff when it comes to transport and particularly decarbonisation of transport. Phil, you head up the Research Hub for Decarbonised, Adaptable and Resilient Transport Infrastructures, DARE for short, which is working to upgrade and decarbonise the UK's national, regional and local transport infrastructures. Can you tell us a little bit about the hub's work?
Sure. Okay. Well, DARE is funded jointly by the UKRI, the Government Research Council, and the DFT, and it's really an attempt to bring together two areas of transportation that haven't really been linked that much in the past. The whole thing around decarbonisation and moving our transport systems and networks toward net zero, but also looking at the adaptability and resilience of that transport infrastructure, so it can continue to operate, or we have to do things and adapt it in a way that it will operate as the effects of extreme weather through climate change kick in. And what we're trying to do, we're trying to bring a sort of systems of systems approach to this, trying to understand all aspects of it and bringing a bunch of models together. It's led by Newcastle University, but also includes Cambridge as a major partner, and also Glasgow University and Heriot Watt, and bringing lots of these models together to really try and understand the real challenges in that transition from where we are now towards decarbonisation, but also towards ensuring that our transport networks remain resilient as the effects of climate change kick in. And that's really important. You know, transport's never really been high on the political agenda. I think the discussions about the impact of logistics and transport due to Brexit and then due to COVID really raised its profile within government. And we realised that if we don't get an effective transport network for people moving to work, moving the economy, moving logistics, society could fall to bits very, very quickly. And if climate change could be that disruptor, we could have some real challenges there. So that's what we're trying to address.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the importance of transport, and I suppose it's the raising of its profile, because it is all around us, as you say, and it's a crucial part of what makes a modern society. What progress are we making as a nation to decarbonising, and what's going well, and maybe what's holding us back?
Okay, well, as you know, from a transport point of view, the Department for Transport published their decarbonisation strategy in 2021. And that included an awful lot of work on electromobility, because within domestic emissions, transport is the highest emitter, just under 30%. And of that 30%, well over 85% is from road transport. So in a sense, the low-hanging fruit to make a difference quickly has been dealing with the decarbonisation of road transport, and hence this transition towards electromobility and electric vehicles. The challenge is that won't work for everything. We probably need other energy vectors, maybe hydrogen, maybe drop-in fuels, maybe e-fuels for larger vehicles, off-road vehicles, trains, boats, planes, etc. And we need to understand that. But also, you know, from the resilience point of view, one of the concerns we're looking at is if we're putting more and more of our eggs for transportation in the electric basket, relying on electricity, then if we have problems with the resilience of the electricity network, we have massive problems with the resilience of the transport network as well. And that may cause additional problems that we didn't have 5-10 years ago. So we're trying to understand that whole system. There are efforts to decarbonise all the modes. The challenge is that I don't believe it can only be technical solutions replacing one form of energy and fuel for transport, or a particular type of transport by another, and also looking at what we need to do to the infrastructure. A lot of the stuff is behavioural, getting people to think about doing things differently as an individual, as society, as business, as government, and as a nation. And that's what I think we're really missing. Behavioral's touched on a bit in the transport strategy. When we think about COP26 back in 21, in Glasgow, all the politicians at the end of it were slapping each other on the back saying, haven't we done well? We've got a plan. But the plan was all technology will solve the problem, and it'll largely be business as usual for the economy, for society. And it didn't really consider the scale of transition that's needed and how we do things, how we work, how we travel, how we consume. That is needed to really deliver on the whole net zero. Although I should say I'm only focusing on the transport and the transport related parts of that.
I mean, it's interesting you mentioned behaviour change, because that's often at the nub, at the root of a lot of change that we want to see in various business sectors. And, transport is so intimately involved in people's almost sense of self, particularly when we talk about personal transport. I mean, in your view, how do we persuade people to change their behaviour? And maybe looking at that another way as well, how do we persuade government to help people to persuade to change their behaviour?
I mean, there's lots of activities in that space, but the real challenge is that we're all consuming a lot of transport for work, for pleasure, for health and everything else. And we don't have enough alternatives to using the car in many cases to enable people to switch to other modes. You think about London, which has a fantastic integrated transport system. Unless you have a very good reason, you wouldn't bring a car or a van into London because you've got a fantastic system. We don't have similar systems with similar levels of frequency in the rest of the country. And until we do that, it's really hard to push people out of cars. You can look at demand and supply-led approaches like congestion charging, as we have in London. You can look at trying to encourage people to use public transport by putting better public transport on and making it cheaper. But at the moment, for a lot of people, there isn't that alternative. We need to try and help them think that there are alternatives. Think about healthy mobility options such as walking, cycling. Think about the innovation thing that micromobility might offer, giving that last mile of transport. But at the moment, if there isn't enough good quality public transport and it's not being used by enough people, so it actually washes its face into economically, then we've got a challenge. So with that nudging, that persuading people to do things differently is really important. And that's part of the challenge. And if they do that, then there are whole new implications on what sort of infrastructure we need and support, and how will that infrastructure cope when we have these weather events due to climate change, etc.
One of the things that comes to mind, because you said it isn't just about changing one form of power, one form of fuel for another. How important is adaptation when it comes to greener transport? What can be done practically in that area, and particularly at scale?
Well, I think adaptation is really, really critical. And again, I think it's an area we haven't looked at enough in the UK. I know we've got some great expertise, but I think nationally we haven't looked at it well, because adaptation essentially means we've got our infrastructure, we've got our transport system, we've got our transport networks. How do we change them? How do we make them more resilient? How do we change them in a way that they A, become more decarbonised, and B, become more resilient to climate change? That may mean different mechanisms for the maintenance of that infrastructure, maybe sticking lots of sensors into the infrastructure, what we call intelligent infrastructure, so you can work out how the infrastructure is performing and when it needs maintaining through condition-based maintaining based on the data, rather than this time-based maintaining where you may look at your bridge, or you may look at your road, or you may look at your railway every 2 years because that's what it says on the schedule, and you may waste your time doing that because all that transport infrastructure should be fine. So we've got to think differently. I think we've also got to think about trying to keep a lot of our current infrastructure running for longer, because if you tear it down and build new infrastructure, there's a whole massive new amount of carbon associated with the building of that infrastructure. Although we're looking at things like decarbonized concrete and moving away from steel to composites and things like that, there's still a big amount of carbon based in that. And also just being aware of where there are hot points and threat points in the infrastructure and trying to protect those. And you've really got two choices. You can either, well, you've got three. You either scrap it and move it somewhere else. That's hugely expensive, but may well be necessary as worse weather conditions and sea levels rise. The other two choices are you build your infrastructure in a way that it gets flooded, it gets damaged, it fails for a while, but you can recover it quickly, so it doesn't impact on the economy and the transport system for too long. Or you build it in a way that it is future-proof to that climate change and will operate in very extreme conditions. There's an order or two of magnitude of cost in, fail and recover or make it absolutely 100% perfect, that it won't be impacted. And that's the decisions that the local authorities, government and other stakeholders will have to make. And we're hoping to gather the evidence and develop the models so they can test that. For example, at Newcastle, we're developing we've got a weather model which can look at a fairly local area and look what the extremes of weather might be like in 10, 20, 30 years time. So you can see what the impacts on the infrastructure and the impacts on the transport network and the transport service delivery could be, and then make decisions on what you need to do now with existing infrastructure, which is your adaptation, or how you should build future infrastructure that can better cope with those extremes.
So that's, I mean, it's interesting talking about resiliency, because we've seen the news over the last 48 hours with what's happening in Nottingham. Well, not just Nottingham, it's throughout the country. Listening to the news this morning, you mentioned some of the potential solutions there. How else can we make transport systems more resilient in the face of these climate events, which we know are coming? We can't avoid them, they're on the way. And also, what's the time scale for this? And how do we get the buy-in for the inevitable investment, I assume, that will be needed, for these changes?
Well, I'm hoping this hub will help provide some of the evidence for that investment. And as I say, it's really important because we're trying to look at the decarbonisation transition and that adaptive and resilience of the infrastructure transition as well. And quite often they're not mutually inclusive, they're mutually exclusive. Like I say, electromobility helps with decarbonisation, but actually potentially reduces the resilience of the transport network due to its reliance on one energy source and the delivery of that in terms of electricity. We need to understand what these extremes are, and we're not just talking about water, we're talking about heat, we're talking about wind, we're talking about dryness. All these things have different impacts on infrastructure in terms of expansion, contraction, and wear. And we need to understand that. So we've got partners like Network Rail, Highways England, National Highways, lots of local authorities and regional authorities who have their own specific problems. Because I think one of the uniqueness of this hub is we're trying to look at what the local problems are. So we have Cambridgeshire County Council for example, we have Manchester, we have the Northeast. They all have unique different sets of problems in terms of resilience and how do they decarbonize. We're trying to look at that from that level too, and seeing how what we learn from there can be scaled up and transitioned elsewhere. But some things have got to be done quickly. So at the moment, because the project only started a couple of months ago, it runs for 41 months. We're looking at what potentially could be some of the low-hanging fruit case studies that we use. How can we make some difference now? If we learn from that, how can we take it to the next level where we're looking at some of the more difficult things? But it's also the other thing that's not really being considered well is the interdependencies, both between different transport modes, but also between transport modes and other important sectors like energy, like ICT and communications and the like, and how they all interact on each other, and trying to understand that, the loss of one may have a massive impact on the other. So I think they're pretty important questions that need to be drilled down to very, very soon. And we're beginning to work on that. And although the hub is essentially the 4 academic institutions and about 50 stakeholders that signed up for the hub when we submitted it, the idea of the hub, now it's running, is to bring in all the expertise from academia, all the expertise from stakeholders, industry, transport providers, and from the local authorities and regional authorities to really be the one-stop shop for discussion and action on this. And the other thing we've committed to in the hub, which I think is really important, is there's a lot of modeling going into this, lots of models being brought together, different scales of models as well, which is quite challenging. But what we've committed is to make sure that the outputs from this, the models that can be run to look at what does this mean for flooding in Cambridgeshire, what does this mean for building a new railway line in Northumberland, the models will be open source and there will be training and stuff available, so it can be run by the local authorities, run by the stakeholders, run by the industry. So not just relying on the academics in their ivory towers to do that. They can actually look at it themselves and do all those what ifs and tests and whatever to actually see what might be the best solution for them.
So the hub is going to facilitate then a degree of knowledge sharing, of knowledge transfer, so that we can, so that those stakeholders can discuss and find out what innovations work, maybe what don't, in order to do things better. Is that one of the aims of your work?
Yeah. I mean, obviously, there's the clear academic work, but that engagement, that bringing together the stakeholders and making sure we develop a national view on this, I think is really, really important. And certainly, I get the feeling that the DFT is relying on us to do this. And I think, from their perspective, this is a new mechanism for funding, putting quite significant funding in with UKRI and having these hubs where it's now our responsibility to make sure we bring together the great and the good and the best of the UK together to solve these problems. And work
you mentioned funding, Phil. I'm glad you mentioned funding, because everywhere at the moment is facing funding challenges in the face of the economic challenges that we all know about. Do you sense that there's any danger that the government may backtrack on their decarbonisation commitments in the face of those economic challenges? Or do you think, this is just something that's so important, it's got to be done, the commitment's there, because obviously we're going to see a change of government, or potentially a change of government next year. We mustn't get ahead of ourselves.
Even this year, possibly.
Well, who knows? The second half of the year, to paraphrase the Prime Minister. Anyway, do you feel any sense of, sort of danger that, in the face of economic challenges, the funding might not be there for the long term?
I mean, clearly climate change and the impacts of that are an existential threat to the UK and to the world at large. And so it's got to be a priority. But you've got to recognise that government has a whole load of other priorities at the moment, including the one of the current government wanting to win an election. So there have been some changes. They changed the plan to introduce by 2030, you couldn't buy a new petrol or diesel car. That's now moved to 2035. And on reflection, was probably not the wrong thing to do, because I don't think industry could deliver all the vehicles that were needed by 2030 and the cost to individuals. But they've got to keep the faith, I think, with climate change, because we've got the opportunity to be a leader in this as a country, and that the whole green technology, green industry, green expertise, I think, is really important. If countries that are relatively wealthy, like the UK, can't deliver on climate change, what about the countries that are emerging or are at the bottom of the sort of pile? What are they going to think about? So we need to make sure we can do things. But I think we need to look at where we can make a difference now, and where we can actually maybe help export some of those ideas elsewhere. So there is always a risk, and certainly when you talk to government now, that gung-ho attitude of climate change before anything else, decarbonisation before anything else, is softening. There's a view that, apart from transport, it's helping deliver value for driving and drivers, and decarbonisation is part of that, but it's not in the same way at the moment. I'm sure that will change as time goes on, but I think we just got to go forward, deliver what we can deliver, provide the evidence that hopefully others can use too, to make sure that we are delivering the best pathways to decarbonisation and net zero, and ensuring that our infrastructure is resilient. Because if we wake up one day with the real impacts of climate change really hitting us, like you mentioned, the floods we have this week, and we continually fail to deal with the infrastructure challenges of that, the impacts on society, the impacts on the economy are massive. Will insurance companies be able to continually pay out for all the harm caused by the flooding, or will they get to a point saying, sorry, these risks are too high, we will no longer be able to cover that, as they're doing with domestic properties that have been built on floodplains and the like? There's another conversation to be had on that, which is
well, absolutely. And I've spoken to insurers in the past, and they're certainly looking at these areas about, because it is all about risk, isn't it? And they feel it keenly because they're the ones who are paying it out. And you know, they may well come a point where they say, well, actually, it's just not insurable.
Yeah, and that's what we're
anymore.
hoping to understand all those complex risks better with our models, so we can say, look, here's where risky areas might be impacted by climate change, but here's the adaptations and resilience you could put in place to overcome that. And as you've seen in some areas, the Environmental Agency have been very good at putting flood protection in, but even some of those new ones have been overwhelmed because the scale of the problem's getting greater. And it's a no-brainer. If the world's heating up, more water is going to come out of the oceans, and it's got to fall somewhere. And unfortunately, it seems to be choosing to fall on the northeast where I live significantly at the moment, and the West Mids and East Mids.
Bill, just a couple of final questions just to wrap things up. I'm always interested in people who work in this sector about, you know, what inspires you. You know, can you recall, the first moment where you became aware of climate change? That's the first thing. And then, and also, who or what inspires you about working in this sector?
Okay, good questions. I mean, obviously, the climate change scientists have been around for a long, long time. But I think in the early days, we're talking about 20, 30 years ago, I think they failed quite a lot in getting the messages across. They made it all very panicky without actually trying to deliver on the science, and not just saying there's a problem, but actually saying, and here's the sort of things we can do. And I think there's a lot of climate scientists are really optimistic that if we get the technology right, if we change the way we do certain things, if we change some of our behaviors, we can deal with a lot of this. In terms of my first real contemplation about climate change, I guess as a kid, I lived in a council house in Framwellgate Moor in Durham, and every winter we had fantastic snow, and we used to go to a hill around the back of us called Beck Hill, and we used to sledge for about 3 months of the year. It was brilliant. And you had to stop at the bottom because the clue was there's a beck. If you don't stop, you go into the water. When my kids were born, they're both in the mid-20s now. Snow is almost a treat. It's happened once or twice or 3 times in their young lives, and it just shows there are changes in the weather. There's a lot more hot weather in parts of the world, and that's moving, and there's a lot more wet weather as well, and it's beginning to show those extremes are happening. And when you look at all these photographs of what's happening in the Arctic, the Antarctic with the ice flows, that's really concerning, because that's big volumes of water that's melting. So it was probably when the kids were younger, when you start thinking more about the legacy and the future. And I was thinking about, where can I go and take my kids so they can go on a sledge and go on the snow, and there wasn't the opportunity in the same way there was when I was a kid. In terms of why I keep on doing this, I've always been an enthusiast and an optimist about we can make things better. I mean, I started off in transport, more in the technology side, looking at how we deal with congestion with things like road pricing, how we can make transport more accessible for older people and the like, and a whole raft of other things. And the UK is great at innovation, great at ideas. Sometimes we're not so good at turning them into practicalities and products, but that's another thing. But I'm optimistic. If government still provides leadership, so people know that what they're investing their time and their money into is actually meaningful and can actually deliver, I think we can way to mitigating a lot of the effects of climate change. I feel sorry for some other parts of the world where I think the geography and the location means that they are going to be hit extremely hard, and are indeed being hit now. But I'm optimistic we can do a lot. I think things are going to be different. And I really would say that we cannot just rely on technology. We've got to think about, as a society, as a nation, how we should do some things differently to try and reduce the impact of climate change, reduce the CO2, reduce the amount of carbon we're emitting as a nation. And clearly that may have impacts on the economy. It may not be bad impacts. We may just find new activities in the economy to generate wealth. I think the whole green economy is part of that, and sourcing stuff more locally rather than these crazy CO2 footprints of so much stuff that's brought into the UK. But a lot of those are policy questions for people in Westminster, not for myself, but that's just my thought on it.
Bill, we've run out of time, as we always do on these interviews. Thanks very much indeed, and I'm sure your research hub for decarbonised, adaptable and resilient transport infrastructures will contribute to the government's thinking as it moves forward in this absolutely vital area for all of us. Thanks very much for talking to me today. Thanks to everybody for listening and watching our Climate Perspectives interview. A reminder that you can follow us on Spotify to get content updates, hear more interviews, and also listen to our regular thought leadership articles. Once again, many, many thanks to Phil Blythe for joining me today, and we'll see you again in the future. Thanks very much for listening and for watching. Bye-bye now.